Welcome back to the panel discussion, Attracting and Retaining the 2020 Workforce, sponsored by Accenture on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Today, our guests are Deborah Kircher, the Chief Human Capital Officer for the Office of Director of National Intelligence, Angela Bailey, the Chief Human Capital Officer for the Homeland Security Department, and Joe Goldstein, the Managing Director for Global Talent and HR Business Process Outsourcing for Accenture. Before break, we were talking a lot about the recruitment strategy, the understanding of the types of people that agencies or organizations need, and then each recruitment is the same but a little different. So let's talk about that in terms of the data behind all of that. How do you know what skill gaps you have? And then once you know what skill gaps, how do you fill them? Where does the data point you? Let me start with Deborah on this one. When you guys look at your data, and what is it telling you first about the skill gaps, and then how do you use that data to ensure that you are filling those skill gaps?
Sure. So each IC element, again, will do the workforce. That's part of the workforce analysis. What they'll do is they'll go out and look at their mission requirements, and they'll, again, try to put the attrition rates in there, people eligible to retire, to determine what gaps do they need to fill in the short term and, of course, in the long term. From there, they'll put together their recruiting strategy. It's a very well thought out methodology as they move forward. Looking at areas, specific schools, maybe where they've had successes in the past. Also looking at professional organizations where we've had great success in the past. Also, we do very well with internship programs. That's a very good entry point for a lot of students to come in. They get a better understanding of the IC agency and vice versa. And that also provides the students with a security clearance. We look at those metrics, usually have a very, very high success rate with converting them into full-time employees. So we look at all those data metrics. Each agency does that independently. Then what we also do is we get together as a community. We have an IC recruiting council. So the 17 recruiting offices get together, and they have a discussion about best practices, where those gaps are, and they share that information, and they may go to different recruiting events together, or if one agency perhaps can't make it, they'll cover for somebody else. So we try to do the shared services as much as we can to include resume sharing. Wherever available, if employees are, if they agree to it. If we might get some great candidates in for cyber and we can only hire, say, 10 or 20, but there's another IC element that can hire more, we try to do that and do the shared services.
That was going to be my question about the resume sharing. One thing about this is you seem to describe the newer entrants into the workforce, the college graduates and such, but there's also that middle area. What I've heard is there's a big bathtub effect in many agencies where they're okay on the new side. They're doing very well, obviously, on the people with 20 plus years of experience. But it's that 10 to 20 years experience that's tough. Is that part of that discussion too? The middle ground.
It is part of the discussion because you have to look at the whole picture, obviously. So there's the very senior group at the very top. They're eligible to retire in the federal government. So you say that they're eligible in the next 5 years. If you take them out of the mix and they've got the institutional knowledge, then you've got that thin layer below in the intelligence community, maybe with a 20 to 30 year seniority, and then the rest of the bulk is your newer workforce. So that's why, too, that we have to adjust to the newer workforce and what their requirements are and their expectations. So we have to continue to groom them and get them ready for the leadership positions, assuming that everybody that's eligible to retire is going to leave in 5 years.
And while it may not be 5 years, it will be 7 or 10 or so.
Right.
So getting people kind of down that path. Angela, let me turn to you. From a DHS perspective, you basically probably have a very similar problem as Deborah does within the intelligence community where, again, plenty of people at the top, probably a decent amount of the 0 to 5 years, but that middle, the soft, thin middle, as you will call it, are you guys finding that that's also part of that metric developing process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, I could sit here and just say ditto, to everything that was said. And I think one of the areas though, where we want to focus in on is I want to kind of go back to the data. So whenever we look at our requirements, it's not really just about our requirements today. I think we're really good at knowing what our requirements are today because we have all that available. But it's really taking a look and saying to ourselves, what are the requirements 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, especially from an intelligence standpoint, especially from where we have to almost do scenario planning, and we have to really start thinking about if the country goes down this path, or if if the following events occur overseas, or if the following events occur, whether it's natural disasters or whatever, building out those what-if scenarios and requirement building off of those, that really helps us then set the stage for all right, then what paths do we want to go down from an academic standpoint, or from a talent, acquisition, or from growing our own workforce? Because some of these things where we know the nation's going, or we know the economy's going, or from a intelligence standpoint or a defense standpoint, those don't grow overnight. Mm-hmm. And so we're always running to catch up if the only data we're looking at is what's sitting in front of us. And so just to add to what Deborah's saying, and I'm sure that the intelligence community is doing this along with private sector, but that's a crucial part of this whole data view that we're really trying to take.
Now, similar to OD&I, DHS has a lot of components. CBP is a little different than ICE, which is a little different than FEMA. Do you also have the very similar, she called it an IC recruiting council. Do you have something similar at DHS?
Yes, we actually do have a recruiting council where the components participate on that recruiting council. So where we can get commonality across the board, of course we're going to do that. So for example, take our law enforcement positions. We know for a fact that that's an area where we would like to increase the number of women, which is not I don't care where you go, women aren't very prominent in the law enforcement community. So collectively across the board, regardless of which component it is, that's an area where we're focusing in on women's councils and law enforcement women's councils to actually kind of grow that talent. That's where we can map ourselves to the military transition offices. So where we can actually do veterans recruiting, but veteran women recruiting and, different things like that. So those are common issues across the board. But then every component, of course, is going to have its own unique things that it's dealing with. For example, if you're on the southern border, the ability to speak Spanish is really incredibly important. If you're up with our northern brother, not so much,
you know. Speak Canadian.
As in Canadian.
Yeah, how do you speak Canadian?
That's right. How do you speak A? So, so those are the kinds of things that might make it unique.
Joe, let me turn to you. When you hear them in terms of the data discussions and looking at data for today and tomorrow, are you seeing very similar things happening either at other agencies or other clients you work with?
Yeah, actually, I was sitting here listening, and I was thinking that most of the organizations I talk to would love to have the focus on data and the sophistication for using data that both of you just outlined. Mm-hmm. I mean, there really is a non-negotiable need to understand where the best candidates come from, where you've had the most success, so that you can make the right investment decisions going forward. The focus on understanding your needs for tomorrow, 3, 5, 15 years, also becomes very important. Using the data and using predictive analytics helps you as part of the workforce planning and strategy. And so I have to applaud you both, because many of the organizations I talk to struggle with finding the data and then understanding it and using it. So I think you are both leading in that area.
Do you get a sense of why there's a struggle to find the data? I mean, it's in some ways, your workforce, who you've hired, who's left, roughly how old they are and what gender they are. What's so hard about it?
Yeah, well, for many of our clients, what we're finding is the data sits in 15 different areas of the business.
It's an IT problem.
And it's not always owned by human resource, right? If you're really going to figure out what the indicators are of retention and high performance, you tend to have to reach into the business, right, to supplement your workforce data with business data, and getting the focus on aggregating that data and understanding it and then using it seems to be an exception rather than the rule.
Angela, do you find that when as you have been at DHS now for a few weeks, that this idea of disparate data and where to find it and does it exist and how good is it? Is that something that you guys are starting to look at or have been looking at? I know you guys, for instance, have the Management Cube, which is a great program that we've talked about many times on Federal News Radio, but you get a sense of that data problem is, as Jill described it, something that everyone faces.
I actually think that this is where we do excel, which is to Jill's point, and it's actually not even just within DHS. I think across the government, what you're really starting to see, and I noticed this even at OPM, is that the HR world is moving beyond just hiring HR specialists, right? We're not just hiring recruiters anymore. We have whole cells that are completely dedicated to doing nothing more than data analytics. Growing the data, figuring out the data governance, figuring out how to integrate the data, figuring out what that data means, analyzing it, reporting health metrics on the different things that we're trying to track and stuff. So we're actually starting, it is the HR community that's actually starting to bring that to the table and say, have you really looked at what your workers' comp is, your lost time, your sick leave usage, your leave without pay, and bumped that up against your FES scores and figured out that, A, you have a problem in that particular unit across the board, and so it's not just about looking at 3 questions on the employee viewpoint survey. It's not about that. It's about looking at all the data and seeing where it all correlates together, and then being able to do a lot of that predictive analysis and bringing that to the table, and then you can really get targeted and focused on where you're going to spend your money, because we're not swimming in money.
No.
So you can't pay everybody a 10% pay increase across the board. You have to figure out, is it Southern Los Angeles because I'm competing against private sector and can't afford it there? Whereas in maybe a rural part of New York, the salary is fine the way it is because all day long I can get folks there. But that's the kind of analytics and things that we're really, I think, becoming extremely good at.
Deborah, give me your perspective.
So on that note, very good points made. I couldn't agree more that you're watching the whole HR, really the philosophy of HR and the mechanics of HR going through transformation. And I think you're seeing this across, certainly we're seeing it through the intelligence community. And what you're hearing now is a lot more of the talent management offices, directorates, mission centers standing up, where it's all encompassing. And everybody understands that they're just as important as a mission element. And that these talent management centers are now standing up with the reorganization. Obviously, it's CIA, NSA. So we're seeing a lot of those in the intelligence community. But you have to look at the big picture, that it includes the tactical, it includes the workforce development, the retention, the training, the long term. So from the employee from start to finish. What we've done too is we've developed again shared service, the IC applicant gateway, for everybody to have the one place to go and look at. Again, this helps kind of do our forecasting and helps the employees or potential employees or applicants take a look for jobs in the future. Like you said, what's a program analyst? Most people won't know what that means, so they can go in and do like this job exploration tool, and that helps formulate some of our metrics as well too.
So let me just ask you to clarify the IC applicant gateway. Mm-hmm. It's for people who are looking for jobs, or people on the other side, the IC community, looking for people?
Well, actually both. Yeah. So actually both. The good news is we actually we had some working groups with college students and young people take a look at it, like what works for them if you're looking for a job or for a career, because everybody has a lot of different titles, but what does that mean? So it helps them in that regard to help get an idea where the jobs are in the intelligence community and what jobs are available. And then on the flip side, it helps the recruiters as well as they're doing that recruiting. Also offers opportunities to tell them about the benefits, because it is more than just the job. It's the long-term training opportunities, long-term education, et cetera.
So it seems like, Joel, this goes back to something you said previous part of the conversation, where it's the targeted recruiting, it's making the proposition value. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about, react a little bit to what Deborah and Angela said about, for instance, the way the recruitment is working. Are you seeing that they're bringing in all the different data points, the talent management? Is that happening more broadly as well?
Yeah, actually, what Deborah brought up is something I'd like to kind of add on to, and that is the role of the recruiter is changing. Right, historically, when unemployment was up, there was never an issue of getting the right number of candidates at the top of the funnel so that you could apply your requirements and then get down to a manageable number of new joiners. Today, though, I think all organizations, private and public, are struggling to actually attract that top of the funnel. So when you do actually get a qualified candidate, the recruiter now has that additional responsibility of representing the agency, selling the value proposition, translating the job description into something real. And so it has really forced, I think, many organizations to rethink about the role of the recruiter. And so that would be the one thing that I would add. I think you hinted at it, Deborah, right? Especially because now those recruiters are also needing to infuse that data into every single sourcing approach that they use. And it is sometimes on an individual basis, because we have spoken about generations, we have spoken about roles, but there also could be a different strategy based on locality. And so it becomes very complicated.
And I think that's the data piece too, is the locality, because as Angela was saying, Southwest Los Angeles may be harder to recruit than middle of Kansas, but at the same time, the one strategy doesn't fit all anymore. And I think, and I haven't been around not that long in the government world, but I can say that I've seen that people are starting to move in that direction. Do you get the sense, Angela, that agencies recognize, as Joel said, that the recruiting strategy and the recruiter must change to evolve?
Absolutely. I think not only have they recognized it, they have. They have evolved into something much different than in the past. And I just think that we cannot undervalue or overestimate, whatever is the right word, but the importance of data and making sure that we understand what our strategies are, or, going forward. I will say this, though, that the only watch out that I have is that we can't become so enamored with the data that it gets to the point where we just keep collecting and collecting and collecting and overanalyzing it, and we never actually move on and implement things. So I think we take the data, it's a snapshot, figure out a strategy, even if it's an 80%, just get it moving, get it implemented, and then adjust that 20% as you move along based on more data that's coming in. But this quest for perfect data is never going to happen. And so, we're really good with this whole pendulum swing. No data to let's analyze 1,000 points of light, right? And so somewhere in between, we have to figure it out.
It's funny you brought up the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, and I know OPM has done a tremendous job of getting more data to agencies. And as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking, but is it data overload? And that's where we're going to take a break and maybe come back and hit up that issue of data overload. You're listening to the panel discussion, Attracting and Retaining the 2020 Workforce, sponsored by Accenture on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.